Urim, to go get a little bit of a deeper insight into our tefillah, into our davening activities, which are in principle familiar to everybody, but actually contain much more than we usually think about. It's one of the paradoxes, really, of Jewish life, that the text about tefillah is extremely complex and deep and multi-layered and has a tremendous depth of meaning to it. And in reality, when we come to shul, we tend to just zip through it at an amazing pace, and it gives us very little time to really reflect properly on it. So my goal is initially to look at some of the more conceptual ideas behind tefillah and the origins of tefillah, and then afterwards to zoom in on certain key themes in the brachas, in the Shemona Esrei, in the Kriya Shema, in some of the Tehillim that we say. All this we'll be doing a bit later on in terms of the practical understanding of how to daven and how to focus on one's davening. But I'd like to start just generally with the origins of tefillah and how really tefillah came to be such an essential part of our Jewish life. So I'd like to start off really with the earliest tefillahs that we know about. And one of the interesting things is that Sefer Bereshis, the book of Bereshis, contains within it a narrative, stories of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and their children and their family context. And in that narrative, we find a lot of tefillah. We find a lot of davening. But it's important to understand, and I've mentioned this a few times when we're learning Chumash and Chumash-related topics, the Chumash divides up very clearly between what you might call the narrative part and the legislative part. In other words, some part of the Chumash is simply telling us story accounts of events that took place, but isn't in fact instructing us to do anything at all. It's just telling us stories of our origins, of the origins of Am Yisrael, of the Avos and the Imahos. It's just stories. And the chokhmah really of learning Torah is to try and extract from these stories what the message is. Of course, they're not random stories. Each one of the events, the anecdotes in the Torah about, for example, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, is designed to instruct us in a certain way. And therefore, it follows that when, for example, we find Yaakov Avinu davening, he's davening. It's important for us to know that he davened, but he's also in some way showing us how to daven. How do we stand before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and pray to God? How do we do this? Interestingly, we don't, from the book of Bereshis and the stories of the Avos, we don't get from them the obligation to daven. I was at no point does Avraham, Yitzchak, or Yaakov, or anybody in the book of Bereshis say, and therefore you, the Jewish people, should stand and daven every day, because they were not in the business of legislation. Legislation, halachic rulings, only start from Sinai, which is halfway through the book of Shemos. Then we start getting the Torah giving us mitzvahs and chukim and the halachic system, which tells us what to do. So in a strange sort of way, the Torah is structured in a way that we are told how to do it, even before we're told what we're supposed to do. We're not even given the mitzvah of davening in the book of Bereshis at all. That we're not given mitzvahs, hardly any mitzvahs at all in the book of Bereshis. There are 2 or 3, but I'm not going to go into that for the moment. But in general, the book of Bereshis is there to give us an insight into our origins as they pertain to the life of the Jewish people. And the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and the stories of Yosef and the brothers lay the foundations for Jewish life. And the same is true about Tefillah itself. So I'd like to start off just by looking at one of the famous tefillahs in the Torah, said by Yaakov Avinu at the beginning of Parshas of Vayishlach. And I'm looking at this not because we're learning Chumash now, but because what we're looking at to see a template, a format for how to daven. And this is an interesting thing. In other words, it's clear that when we're davening, we're standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu to communicate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But we can't just say any old thing. There is a format for davening. There's a way to do it, which is considered to be the appropriate structure of our Tefillah. So I'm now going to share the screen with you, and we're going to have a look at something. There we go. I hope everybody can see this. This is four psukim translated from Bereshis chapter 33 from Parshas Vayishlach. You will recall that this is the point in time where Yaakov has just built up a whole family, and he has been separated from Esau for many, many years, for maybe about 36 years. He's been separated from Esau. And now Esau hears that Yaakov is returning to the land of Israel, and he is galloping towards Esau with his full military following. And Yaakov perceives that his life and the life of his whole family, and therefore the future of a Jewish people, is at risk. And he stands and davens. And these are four psukim I want to have a look at with a view to seeing what is the format that we can relate to. So the first pasuk reads, I'm going to read it in Hebrew, but you can follow in English. Vayomer Yaakov Elohei avi Avraham Elohei avi Yitzchak. So Yaakov starts off by recalling his father and grandfather, Avram and Yitzchak. And indeed, it's from this format that we derive, that the Chachamim derived the format of our Shemona Esrei. That every time we stand to daven, we start and say, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. And this is a format, we'll see in a minute from the Rambam, who wrote that format, but the origin of it is here in Parshas Vayishlach, where Yaakov, the Torah gives us the text of Yaakov's Tefillah. And already here there's a very profound idea which I want to mention just now, but I'm not going to develop it just yet. And that is that the concept of Tefillah in Jewish life is a covenantal concept. In other words, when we are standing in Tefillah we're standing in prayer before God, we're not standing as individuals. We are standing as members of a covenant which goes back several thousand years, and that gives us, in a sense, the right, gives us the ability, the platform on which to stand in order to speak to God. In other words, otherwise, the whole idea of me, a seemingly sort of an insignificant, puny human being of flesh and blood, of dubious, doubtful merits, standing before the creator of the world and saying anything at all, seems to be outrageous. It seems to be something which is impossible and ridiculous. And by what right do we stand to daven at all? And the answer is, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, that we are coming as representatives of those people with whom there is a covenant. In other words, there is a Brit Avot. The whole of Tefillah really rests on this idea of a Brit Avot, of a covenant with our ancestors, that we are able and allowed to stand before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and daven. And Yaakov Avinu is already here in Vayishlach, giving us the first indication of this. That that's the way to daven. That's the way we have to daven. I'll just mention in passing, actually, an interesting question and discussion in the Talmud and in the halachic authorities. When a convert, a ger or giores, somebody who was born non-Jewish and converted into Judaism, when they stand in prayer, are they allowed to say Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov? Are they allowed to refer to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as their ancestors? because in actual fact, in real terms, this is not true, right? It's not. Let me just go back to this for a second, right? This is an interesting question. For the ger or the giores, the convert, to cite Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as their ancestors seems to be factually incorrect. They are not genetically descendant from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The Jewish people are descendant. And therefore we can stand and say we are part of this covenant, but is a ger or a gioret allowed to do this? And this is something of a debate in the Talmud and in the Rishonim and in the Yerushalmi as well, not in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi as well. And it's not only about the Shemona Esrei, it's also in the Birkat HaMazon. We say, "No de lecha Hashem Elokeinu asher hinchalta la'avoseinu eretz chem d'tov rachava." We say that the land of Israel is something which was given to our ancestors, and our claim to Eretz Yisrael and our link to Eretz Yisrael is Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's the Eretz HaOvos, primarily. That is the main link that we have. And therefore, what about a ger and a giores? And here's a very interesting concept, which the Rambam particularly is interested in. He says that actually in the Torah, the idea of being of children, of being the children of an ancestor, is not necessarily a genetic connection. It is in fact a connection which is built on values and beliefs. In other words, if somebody has adopted the belief system and the values of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they can truly be said to be B'nai Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And therefore, we call a ger Ben Avraham Avinu. We call him up to the Torah, we call him Ben Avraham. But he's not the Ben Avraham. So what are we telling a lie? The answer is that the concept of bonim and bonos means in the Torah not only a genetic connection, but a spiritual connection. Somebody who plugs into Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and shares their values and beliefs can be seen to be a child of theirs. In fact, this is an interesting Rashi, for those of you who are interested in this topic, an interesting Rashi on the first paragraph of Kriyat Shema, which I'll come back to later Shurim when we look at Kriyat Shema, when it says, the Pasuk says, V'shinantam levonecha v'dibarta ba, that you must teach Torah to your children, right? So on the face of it, the Pasuk means, if you have children, teach them Torah, right? Rashi takes that whole Pasuk and flips it upside down and says it means, in a sense, the exact opposite of that. It doesn't mean if you have children, teach them Torah. Rashi says it means anyone to whom you teach Torah is your children. They are your children because they are, by learning your Torah, they have absorbed your values and your beliefs, and therefore they are considered to be your children. It says Rashi there on that pasuk, V'shinantam levonecha b'chol mokoim, right? Rashi says in every place that the Torah speaks about bonim, it means talmidim, says Rashi. It means the talmidim. We are the talmidim of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And therefore, for example, I mean, historically it's well known, there were lots of very great Jewish leaders who had no biological children. Right? The late Lubavitcher Rebbe had no biological children. The Chazon Ish had no biological children. Right? There were lots of great leaders who had no biological children, and nevertheless they had many hundreds of thousands of spiritual children who were their disciples, who followed them, who were influenced by them, and considered to be their bonim ubonos. So the children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are not only the genetic descendants, which is the Jewish people, but also anybody who converts into the Jewish faith is 100% can say Elokei Avosenu, Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They can claim that genealogy and stand in davening in this covenantal way. So let's go back to the text for a second. So the first pasuk, so Yaakov says, he introduces himself. This is my, if you like, entry visa into davening, is that I am a continuation of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I want them to be proud of me and that I am their continuation. And then the pasuk continues, And also you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, told me that the land of Israel is the place to live and the place where I will flourish. And now comes a second pasuk here, which is also crucial for our davening. He starts off by saying, Kotonti mikol hachasodim umikol ha'emes asher osiso im avodecha. Right? The English translation is not completely, I would say, accurate. It wouldn't be the way I would have translated it. The English translation is, I have become small. It doesn't mean that. It means I am too small. I am too small for all the kindnesses that you have already rendered me. In other words, I'm standing before you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, asking for your help, knowing that I don't deserve it, knowing that even what I've already received is more than I deserve. So katonti means what I've already received is more than I deserve, and therefore, and this is a real key to understanding Tefillah properly, we never stand in davening and say, please, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please help me or do something for me because I deserve it or because I have the merits for it. Our initial approach is always one of being undeserving. In other words, every breath of life, every moment of our life, every day we wake up and we're given a new day of life is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everything that we have in our life, every asset, children, happiness, family, whatever we've got, right, is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which we have received undeservingly. In fact, it's interesting, a person who was in a situation of danger and was saved makes the bracha hagomel, right? Birkas hagomel, people are familiar with benching gomel. And in the bracha of hagomel, we say hagomel l'chayovim tovos. What does it mean, chayovim? Chayovim means the bracha says, I have received the grace and the protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even though I am chayovim, I am undeserving. I did not deserve this kindness of God, and I nevertheless acknowledge it, right? And therefore, and it's because of this pasuk here that we open up every one of our tefillas with the phrase Gomel Chasodim Tovim. That when we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we ask for Chazdei Hashem. We don't ask for our rights or what we deserve or for our merits. The whole concept of tefillah is based on a humility. Right? This pasuk is a magnificent pasuk of humility of Yaakov Avinu. Kotonti mikol hachasodim mikol ha'emes. I've already received much, much more than I could ever deserve. And he goes on to say, Ki b'makli ovarti es hayarden hazeh, v'ato hayisi l'shnei machanes. Right? Yaakov Avinu goes to the house of Lavan, and he's completely alone and penniless, with no family and no wealth and no possessions at all. All he has is b'makli. All he has is his stick, right? And now, 20 years later, he's crossing the Jordan back again, and he's returning to Eretz Yisrael, and he has a massive family and massive wealth, which he has acquired in the house of Lavan in Mesopotamia, and he's bringing it back into Israel. I'll say as a footnote here that the story of Yaakov is often mentioned somewhat a little bit humorously as a proof that the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, any wealth that they had, they never made in the land of Israel. It was always wealth that they made in Chutz La'aretz, and they brought their wealth into the land of Israel. And that is true about Avraham as well. Avraham was completely penniless. He went down to Mitzrayim, and only when he came back from Egypt, he brought with him great wealth. And Yaakov also comes back from Mesopotamia, and this is his great wealth. He doesn't make the wealth in Israel. Israel is a good place for spending your wealth, but not a good place for making your wealth. This is a little bit of a humorous remark. Of course, there are lots of people who manage very nicely in Israel to make some wealth, but it's an interesting fact. This pasuk relates to the idea that Yaakov says that when he arrived, when he left Israel, he was penniless and lonely, and now he is a father of a massive family. He has 4 wives and 12 children, I don't think Binyamin is born yet, but he's got Dinah, one girl and 11 boys, and he's coming back into Israel with great wealth. So the first thing he does before he asks for anything is to acknowledge the fact that he's already been the recipient of Chazdei Hashem, of divine beneficence. And then he makes his request. In this next pasuk, pasuk 12, Hatzileni no miyad ochi miyad Esav ki yore onochi osa ben yoav inkani em abonim. I need protection. I need protection from Esav. Esav represents, throughout history, anti-Semitism. Esav represents those who hate and wish to destroy the Jewish people. And Esav is the grandfather of Amalek, and that principle, which sadly follows us in every generation, changes its form, but actually is sadly very powerful in every generation, is the power of Esav. And Yaakov says, I can't survive the power of Esav without your help. So he turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for assistance, not to be swallowed up by the anger and the hostility and the hatred of Esav. Interestingly, in this passage also it says, Hatzileni no. Why does he say miyad ochi, miyad Esav? I need help not only from Esav, but from my brother from Esav. I mean, why does he need to mention that Esav is his brother? Everybody knows Esav is his brother. Why does he need to mention it? So Mefarshim say that Yaakov realized he needed help on two levels. One, from the hatred of Esav, but he also wanted to be protected from the love of Esav, the brotherly love. That if Esav was, as indeed was the case, was to display brotherly love, he needed protection from that, because the brotherly love of Esav only leads to assimilation and loss of Jewish identity. So in actual fact, in this one little pasuk of chapter 32, pasuk 12, is a microcosm of the Tefila of every generation of Jews since this, in the thousands of years since this pasuk was said, that we need help from the terrorists and the people who are determined to destroy the Jewish people. And we also need help not to be sucked in to the love of the secular world, which threatens us with assimilation. All this is inside this very short little pasuk. But this is the request. So he starts off. So basically, this is a play in 4 stages. It starts off by invoking Avram and Yitzchak and the covenant. It goes on to express the view that whatever he's asking for, he's not asking for by right or by merit, but it's only by chesed. The third thing is what he's asking for. He asks for certain things, like in our davening, right? We asked Atachonin Lodam Das. We need HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give us good, help us make good decisions. We need HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give us refuah and parnasa. These are the requests. That's all part of the tefillah. And then it ends up in pasuk 4, Va'ata omarto heitiv eitiv imoch. You have promised us that you will look after us. And that my descendants will be as numerous as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of multitude. Okay, so this is already a praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you have promised us. We are relying on the divine promises, the divine statements made to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The idea of the sand on the sea is also the idea of protection, right? The sand, so to speak, protects the dry land from the crashing waves. And part of what he's davening for here is a tefillah for protection. So what have we got here? Let's just summarize here for a second. We've seen one of the classic, very brief. What happened? Seem to have lost. Right. The Zoom sometimes zooms out and zooms in, so we have to keep track of it. We've seen one of the very, very short tefillas. Generally speaking, in the text of the Chumash, the text of the tefillas are brief. the shortest tefillah that we have on record is Moshe Rabbeinu davening for his sister Miriam when she is struck by the illness of leprosy, and he davens for her, Kael na refa na la. 5 words, 5 short words, 4 of them of 2 letters and 1 of them with 3 letters. A very beautiful, succinct, tiny tefillah, which only goes to show that tefillahs don't need to be long in quantity in order to have a deep quality. Right? It's not the length of the tefillah, but it is the intensity and the kavanah of the tefillah which is important. So we have in the Torah several different examples of how tefillah is to be done. And that's really the starting point I wanted to show you from Yaakov Avinu. Listen, when we want to make our tefillah more meaningful, it's always a good idea to go back to the origins and see how tefillah is presented to us in the Chumash. There are several different examples I could bring or I could have brought. I decided this was, in a sense, the closest to our own experience of davening. I'd like to move on now to the second question, which is, somebody might ask you, well, in Jewish life, what we do is we follow halachic requirements, we follow 613 mitzvahs. Where in the Torah does it say to you should daven? Where is there a mitzvah? What are the words used in the Torah to tell us that there's a mitzvah to daven? Maybe there isn't. Maybe davening is a minhag. Maybe it's something which we just tend to do. But is it in fact one of the Tariag mitzvahs? And if so, where is it written? So that's something which is worth looking at. And for that, we need the greatest halachist of all time, the Rambam. So I'm going to go back to my text. And okay, so that's right. So first of all, I'm going to look at this pasuk here. There's a pasuk that we're all familiar with, which is the second paragraph of the Shema. And again, we'll be looking at the Shema a bit more in detail in later shiurim. But the first pasuk reads, "V'hayo im shamoya tishmu el mitzvosai asher anochi mitzaveh eschem hayom." If you indeed listen to and obey and follow all the mitzvahs that I'm commanding you today, and what am I commanding you? La'ahavos Hashem elokecha, the love of God. And here I've highlighted 3 words, which the Rambam is interested in. And the words are, Ula'ovdo b'chol levavchem, b'chol nafshem. And la'ovdo, so the word la'ovdo means to serve him with all your heart. So to serve him is a bit of a generic word. The truth is, when we build a sukkah, we're serving God. When we eat matzah, we're serving God. In all our mitzvahs, to a certain extent, we are serving God. And therefore, la'ovdo, the service of God, it does not necessarily mean prayer, it doesn't necessarily mean tefillah. But here, the pasuk emphasizes, la'ovdo b'chol levavchem, to serve God with your heart, right? With your thoughts and feelings. The heart, of course, is the metaphorical organ of the body used to mean heartfelt feelings and thoughts. To serve God with your thoughts. So the Gemara analyzes this particular phrase. Generally speaking, avodat Hashem, service of God, expresses itself in all sorts of different activities. But what is the activity which is described as la'ovdo b'chol levavchem? So I want to go down here to the Rambam. Can you see this? The Rambam, and this is Hilchot Tefila, chapter 1. This is the Rambam giving us the laws of Tefillah. So we've seen Yaakov Avinu davening, so we know that when we daven, how we're supposed to do it. But are we supposed to do it? Is it something that is required of us? So the Rambam writes, and I'm reading here from this text, Mitzvahs asay lispalel b'chol yom. There is a mitzvah of the Torah that once a day one should engage in something which he calls lehitpalel. Now it's true, the word hitpalel is not used in the Chumash itself, in the Torah itself. It's a word used by Chazal. We'll see later on how this works. And so the Rambam starts off by saying it is, when the Rambam uses the word mitzvat aseh, he means it's one of the 613 commandments. Like there's a commandment to keep Shabbos and Yom Kippur and to eat kosher. There's a mitzvah to daven b'chol yom. Shenema, va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem. We'll see in a second. Mipi hashmua lomdu. Mipi hashmua means the Torah Shebaal Peh, the Gemara learned, she'avoda zuhi tefila. Shenema ula ovdo b'chol levavchem. So I'm looking at the third line here of this text. Omru chachamim. Rambam here is quoting the Gemara in Titus. Ezu hi avoda shebalev. What could the Torah possibly mean when it speaks about avodah, which means to serve, but it's only taking place balev, it's only taking place in the heart? What could that possibly mean? Zu tefillah. That is the mitzvah of tefillah. And what's interesting is, so we see several things from this first paragraph of the Rambam. And that is, first of all, that the activity of tefillah is not defined halachically as an activity of the mouth, of the speech. Right? Speech is secondary in tefillah. Primary in tefillah is the leiv, is the thoughts and the feelings of the individual. And in a sense, one could, if you like, daven, following this first paragraph of the Rambam, one could, in fact, fulfill the mitzvah of tefillah without saying anything at all, by just having the appropriate feelings and thoughts of one's mind. Except that the human nature is such that thoughts and feelings come and go and waft through our minds and our hearts and leave no trace. It's only through articulating our thoughts and feelings that they become more real and more powerful and more focused. So in actual fact, even though tefillah is about speaking, but that's not the essence of tefillah. The tefillah is avodah shebalev. It's about what we normally refer to as kavana. Kavana means the thoughts and the feelings that you invest in the words of davening. That is of the essence. And this, says the Rambam, is a mitzvah min haTorah. It's one of the 613 mitzvahs which everybody is obligated to do. And then he goes on to say something very interesting. Ve'ein minyan hatfilas min haTorah. The amount of tefillas that we do every day, he's referring, of course, to Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, the 3 tefillas daily. That is not of biblical origin. That was later on instituted by rabbinic legislation at the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So he says that the number of tefillas is not min haTorah. Ve'ein Mishnah hatfilah zos min haTorah. And the text that you say, right, what we call the Siddur, is also not min haTorah. In other words, the Siddur is also of rabbinic creation. Ve'ein tefillah zman kavua min haTorah. And also the time frames of when to daven is not min haTorah. So the Rambam takes us really, and this is one of the brilliant things of the Rambam, he takes us back to basics. He says, let's start off from the ground floor up. The ground floor is the essence of tefillah, is what's going on in your heart and your mind, and you want to speak the words in order to express it. And what happens is that later on, the Chachamim superimposed onto this mitzvah certain times of davening and certain texts of davening. And we'll see in a minute how that happened. But for the Rambam, what he wants to emphasize is that the essential feature of tefillah has not changed. It still remains avodah shebalev. I'd like to just maybe here make a comment on the word avodah, because we're going to be looking at the word avodah in a few different meanings. The word avodah, so in general in Hebrew use, avodah can mean any sort of work, right? Avodah kasha means it can be hard work, right? But in actual fact, if you look at the classical Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, makes a difference between avodah and melacha. Melacha is physical work. For example, when the Torah wants to tell us not to do physical labors on Shabbos, it doesn't say lo taseh avodah. It says lo taseh melacha. Lo taseh kol melacha. right? Avoda is work which is designed to express a submission or a subservience. Right? In Mitzrayim, in Egypt, the Jewish people were involved in avodah kasha. Right? They were doing work which was designed to make them submissive and subservient to the king. And similarly, avodah, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch actually distinguishes between the word avodah and malacha. He says the word avodah comes from the word eved, a servant, and the word malacha comes from the word melech, which means a king. Right? When you're doing malacha, you are actually exercising dominion over the world around you. You're reshaping it. You are structuring it in certain ways. You're creating new things. You're plowing the land. You're building a house. You're writing a document. All this is malacha. Why? Because that's melech. Malchus, the idea of a king, is somebody who puts his imprint on the world, and he is affecting and changing and bringing about a new world. That's the melech. And avodah is what you're doing in order to express the fact that you're not a melech, that you are an eved, that you are subservient to a higher power. And therefore, avodah, Chazal used the word avodah as the key word for expressing the idea of Tefila. We're going to be coming back to the word avodah, right? In modern Hebrew, avodah does not carry that connotation. So you have to be a bit careful with that. The difference between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew is often a bit confusing. Modern Hebrew uses the word avodah to mean a man digging a hole in the street. He's doing an avodah kasha. But in actual fact, classical Hebrew, avodah generally often is avodat Hashem, which means that we're doing an activity designed to express the acceptance of a higher authority. That's what it's designed to do, to express the fact of our being an eved. Let me show you the most classic example of the use of this phrase, and that is at the very beginning of Pirkei Avot. At the very beginning of the Mishnah, Pirkei Avos, I'd like to read these top two lines on the screen in front of you. I'm sort of hopeful that you can see it. Ellie, can you see this? Can you see this text? Yes? Thank you. Good. Just checking. So I'm going to read these two lines. Shimon HaTzadik. Okay, we're being introduced to somebody who was a very interesting personality, and he was one of the transitional figures who was a key person in building the Second Temple, the Bayit Sheni. When the Jewish people came back under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, with the Nevi'im, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last of the Nevi'im, they brought back the Shivat Tzion. They brought back a few tens of thousands of people, came back to rebuild the Second Temple. The vast majority of the Jewish people remained in the diaspora. And this was a major transitional moment for the Jewish people, because the temple was going to be rebuilt. Shimon HaTzadik became the first Kohen Gadol, the first high priest of the Second Temple. And according to Chazal, he remained the high priest for 40 years. So he really established, Shimon HaTzadik was single-handedly responsible for establishing the Bayis Sheni, the second Beis HaMikdash. He was also the nephew of Ezra. Ezra was the Gadol Hadar. Ezra was the great leader of that generation, right? And Ezra was also a Kohen, and he had a nephew who was Shimon HaTzadik, who was the Kohen Gadol. And what does the Mishnah start off by saying? Hayom Mishiorei Knesses Hagdola. He was the Shiorim is an interesting word. Shirayim. Shirayim means, what's a good word for Shirayim? Leftovers. It was the leftover. He was the leftover. In other words, he was one of the few people who survived into the Second Temple period of the Knesset Hagdolah. So this is a whole story, a subject for a whole shir. Who were the Knesset Hagdolah? How were they constituted, and what did they do? But this was a group of Rabbanim. According to the Talmud, it was 120 Rabbanim. But they weren't all living in the same country. They were all just part of one WhatsApp group. That's how they were connected. They weren't living together. They were communicating with each other. But for example, Doniel was living in Bovel, and Mordechai was living in Shushan, and Ezra was living in the rebuilt Jerusalem, together with Shimon HaTzadik, but they were all part of the Shiur of the Knesset Hagdolah. Interestingly, when Medinat Yisrael, when the Jewish state decided to create their parliament, they decided to call it the Knesset, which comes from this word. And because of that, it has 120 members of Knesset, because it was built on the idea of the Knesset Hagdolah of 2,500 years ago. There was a group of 120 Rabbanim. I'm tempted to say here, lahavdil, between the members of Knesset in the modern Knesset and the members of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, lahavdil, they were all the rabbinic spiritual leaders of their generation. I'm not sure that could be said for all the members of the Knesset in the land of Israel. But it's interesting how modern Israeli culture has picked up certain models from Jewish history. And this is one of them. The word Knesset appears here in the Mishnah. And it was the Knesset Hagdolah, the greatest, if you like, association, rabbinic association on record. And Shimon HaTzadik was one of the longest surviving remnants, if you like, of that group. Okay, so we're introduced to this man, Shimon HaTzadik. And you have to understand that he was aware of two things. He was aware of the great gift of restoring the temple and the Jewish presence in the land of Israel, which was to last for several centuries. But he was always also aware of the fact that the vast majority of Jews were seemingly pretty permanently resident in the diaspora. They weren't coming back. Most of them were living in Babylon, in Alexandria, in various other big centers around the world, and they didn't respond to the call of the Persian Emperor Koresh, or of Ezra or Zerubbabel. They said, thank you very much. It's a lovely idea to go back to Israel, but we're quite comfortable, actually, here in Bovel. We've got nice fields and vineyards and built a nice business, and we quite like it here in New York and in Golders Green and in Canada. We quite feel comfortable here. We don't really need to go back with you to the land of Israel. So a lot of what Shimon HaTzadik is addressing, he's giving us a certain shorthand, saying what can we make of Judaism? What really are the key elements of the whole of Jewish life? If you had to really boil it down to one single line, so Shimon HaTzadik does it in the most extraordinary way. And a lot has been written about this Mishnah. So he says, Al Shalosha Devorim Ha'olam Omeid. The world exists because of three different things. In other words, the world is standing, if you like, on a tripod. It's standing on three different legs, spiritually speaking. When God created the world, he had in mind mankind who would engage in three different activities. And here they are. That's what I've underlined here, these 7 words. Al-HaTorah, the study of Torah. Al-Ha'avodah, and Avodah, as I've just explained to you, is a reference to davening. Va'al Gemilut Chasadim, and kindness to other people. So Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim are the 3 pillars for which the world was created. And what Shimon HaTzadik is saying, look, don't forget this. You might be living in Bovel, you might be living in Alexandria or in Golders Green, but it's all the same Torah. And God created, wherever you're living, you need to be able to be connected to all 3 pillars of Jewish life. And our Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. And it's interesting that Avodah, right, is one of these 3 pillars. So So the activity of davening, of tefillah, what we call tefillah, which is referred to here as avodah, he is in a sense elevating it. He's saying this is not simply one of the mitzvahs among the 613 mitzvahs, right? He doesn't mention here the mitzvahs of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, or building a sukkah, or keeping Pesach, or even keeping Shabbos. He's saying there are three pillars on which the whole of Jewish life is based, and they are Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. And if you engage in these three activities, then you are in fact living a full a Jewish life. Maybe not a full Jewish life if you're not coming back to Yerushalayim and to the land of Israel, but nevertheless, this is the if you like, the mission statement. Of all the mission statements in the writings of the Gemara, there are quite a few of them, this is the most succinct. This is the briefest and the most, in a sense, the most powerful. But what it does is, for our purposes, for a shir on the meaning of tefillah, it shows that engaging in tefillah is actually a pillar of Jewish life, more than simply one additional mitzvah. And why is it a pillar of Jewish life? We'll talk more about that as we go along. I'd like to just mention here that looking at these three pillars on which the world rests, there is an interesting understanding of these three pillars using the language of later Gedolei Yisrael, primarily the Maharal, and later on the Vilna Gaon. So the Maharal says as follows, that we are familiar with the idea of mitzvahs bein Odom lemoko, mitzvahs which connect a man with God. And we're also familiar with the idea of mitzvahs bein Odom lechaveira, mitzvahs that connect a man with his fellow man, right? We're engaging in, right? But so avodah, davening, is clearly the primary connection between Odom Lamakom, between man and God. Gemilas Chasadim is the primary connection between man and fellow man. Al HaTorah, and here comes an interesting new insight, if you like, of the Maharal, picked up later on by the Vilna Gaon. It says Al HaTorah is a new type of mitzvah. The mitzvah to learn Torah is a mitzvah bein Odom la'atzma. Interesting idea. It's a very profound idea. To the best of my knowledge, nobody before the Maharal in the 16th century articulated this definition of Talmud Torah. It says the learning of Torah is a mitzvah bein Odom la'atzma, meaning between a man and himself. In other words, the obligations that a person has towards himself, to develop his mind, to develop his neshama, to reach the highest levels of understanding and refinement and knowledge. That is an obligation every person has to himself. So he says, really, says the Maharal, Shimon HaTzadik is telling us that the mitzvahs really come in three categories. There's been Odom Lamoko, what we do between man and God. Not only, for example, Tefillah, also putting on talis and tefillin is a mitzvah ben Odom Lachaveir, ben Odom Lamoko. The Gemilas Chasadim is the full range of chesed, the full range of what we do for other people. But Torah, Talmud Torah, is a mitzvah ben Odom la'atzma. A person has an obligation to develop his own potential. Spiritually, his neshama's potential, his mind, his thoughts. And this is, I think, a very beautiful idea. The Vilna Gaon brings it down in his commentary in Mishlei in a few places. But the original idea was 200 years before the Rabbi Vilna Gaon, already in the writings of the Maharal. There are three categories of mitzvot, which are written here by Shimon HaTzadik. So the Rabbeinu Yonah here, I won't go into it, time is getting a bit short. Rabbeinu Yonah, one of the Rishonim in the Middle Ages, has got a commentary on this, but he just makes the point here. He says that originally Avodah also referred to the sacrifices in the temple, right? When we say in our davening, "V'hoshev es ha'avodah l'dvir beisecha," Ishay Yisrael Tefillah. So it's talking about the sacrifices that the Kohanim were doing. That was the original avodah, right? So he says here that now that we don't longer, that while there was a temple, there needed to be the sacrifices. And look at these last three lines here. Tefila eleinu achshav bimkomo. But for us today, tefillah is instead of all these sacrifices. And therefore, tefillah, when Shimon HaTzadik told people about avodah, he was, of course, also referring to his own activities in the temple, bringing the karbonos, the second temple period. But he was also addressing all those Jews who were living in the diaspora, telling them that the avodah is also tefillah. And in fact, we say that in our davening. We say, "V'hashem is avodah l'dvir b'secha, v'isha Yisrael utfilasa." Both the sacrifices and the tefillah are both different, if you like, manifestations of the same idea. We want to express our acceptance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the acceptance of the dominion of God, and the acceptance of all the Chazdei Hashem. And this is, and then Rabbi Yonah brings down the same pasuk that we saw in the Rambam, La'ovdeh b'chol levavchem, ezer hi avodah shebelev, have'omer zu tefillah. Okay. How much time we got left? We got 10 minutes left. Let's just have a look here. Okay, in Halacha Beis, I'm now looking at the second paragraph of the Rambam. The Rambam uses a certain turn of phrase here, which is maybe not so politically correct in the modern world, but we're not going to get stuck on that for the moment. He says here, noshim va'avodim chayovim b'tefillah. He wants to make a point here, particularly about the obligation of women to daven. Right? Women have an obligation to daven, and what he's really doing here, he is addressing a very common misconception that women have. Many women know that a woman is not obligated in a mitzvat asay shazman grama, in time-bound mitzvahs. But the Rambam says tefillah is not one of them. Tefillah is not a time-bound mitzvah. Look what he says here. The fikah of noshim avodim chayovim b'tefillah, women are obligated in tefillah. The fishi mitzvahs asay shalo hazman grama. Because in essence, the mitzvah of tefillah is to daven every day, irrespective of the time of day or night. Doesn't matter what time it is. So because there's no time frame for it, women are equally obligated in the mitzvah of tefillah as men are. What is true is that the rabbinic obligation of Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, that does not obligate women the same way that obligates men. That is true. But the idea to stand every day and say at least one tefillah, that is obligation equally on men and on women. So the Rambam wants to know, so what is really the minimum format of a tefillah which is said once a day by men and women alike? Incidentally, I grew up in a home where my father went to shul every day, 7 days a week to daven, and my mother also stood and davened for 10, 15 minutes. She stood and davened every morning, every day. I remember my whole life seeing my mother standing and davening. It didn't matter if the doorbell rang or the phone rang or anything. She didn't even look up. She didn't even turn around. When she was davening, that was it. She davened every morning and often every evening before she went to bed. She cried Shema Mitzvah out of a siddur. Every day my mother said tefillas. And who knows, the tefillas of the women of Klal Yisrael have had a tremendous effect on I remember particularly when my brother was in the Lebanon War in 1982, my mother was basically davening round the clock. She wasn't hardly doing anything else at all. My brother was on active service in Lebanon, and every day we heard terrible reports about what was going on in Lebanon, in the tanks in 1982. And Baruch Hashem, my brother came back in good health. But sadly, as we all know, lots of people lost their lives in that terrible time. I'm just saying that the connection of women to tefillah has been an integral part of Jewish history. And in fact, when the Gemara in Brachas wants to look a bit more into the details of tefillah, it brings the tefillah of Chana, the mother of Shmuel, as the prototype mitzvah, the prototype way to daven. We learn lots of halachas out of Chana. So in actual fact, tefillah, it's only because people tend to associate davening with shul, and shul is associated mainly with a men's club, that women tend to think they're not part of it in the same way as men are. But this is a mistaken conception. In actual fact, tefillah is something which takes place in your mind and your heart on a daily basis and obligates men and women alike. It's true shul is important, and it's true that shul is more for men than for women. All that is true, but it doesn't affect the idea that in essence, the tefillahs of men and of women are equally obligated and equally valuable. And now the Rambam continues here. I'm on in Halacha Beis. So here I'm continuing here on. I've highlighted a few words. Elochiv mitzvah zu kachu. What is really the minimum format of this mitzvah? So he says, "Sheyahei odam mitchanen umitpalel b'chol yom," that a person should engage in this tefillah every day, right? And then he says, "Umagid shevocho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu." You should start off by singing the praises of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'achar kach shoel tzrochov, and only afterwards ask for their needs. In other words, that one shouldn't straight away, if one is in a difficult time, first daven in a way where asking for one's needs has primary place. You should start off like Yaakov started off, by starting off by saying, "Okay, Avraham, okay, Yitzchak," by praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the covenant with the others. And then he says in the last two lines here, the Rambam, he says, and at the end, giving thanksgiving. So in actual fact, for the Rambam, every tefillah needs to have three parts to it. It starts with acknowledging the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and our subservience to him. The second part is asking for our needs. And the third part is hoda'ah, which simply means thanksgiving. And thanksgiving is not a less important part of our davening than bakasha, than asking for our needs. So this is, this for the Rambam is the original format of davening. I can see we're coming to the end of the Shia. Next week, I plan to pick up here from the Rambam and continue with it. And the Rambam will explain how did we ever get to what we call the Siddur. The Siddur is something familiar to all of us, but how did that come? The Siddur was not given at Sinai. Where did the Siddur come from? And how important is the Siddur, right? And how important is the text of the Siddur, right? I remember, I'll just finish up with a small anecdote, which always makes me smile. It goes back about 30 years. I was once invited to London University, has got an annual sort of a spring event where lots of Jewish students come together, hundreds of Jewish students come together, and they asked me to come and give a talk. It was not a religious event, it was just a Jewish student organization, the UJS. But they wanted a rabbi to come and give. I said, I'm not going to give a shiur, I'm going to do questions and answers. Like, if you can imagine, I sat at a desk in an auditorium with about 200 students. And I said, you can ask me anything you like, any questions related to Judaism. And it went on for about 2 hours. It was very, very interesting, just questions and answers. But I remember one young woman stood up quite passionately, and she said, why do we need to pray the Hebrew words out of the Siddur? I'm not very good at Hebrew. And whenever I go to shul, they put a siddur in my hand, and it drives me crazy. I can't manage with a siddur. So I said, well, in actual fact, the siddur is there to guide people to daven who can manage Hebrew. If you can't manage Hebrew, you can do it in English. I said, there is no dispute on this fact. It's a Mishnah in Seitar, and it's a Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, that all our davening can be said in any language that you want. And if you've been listening to what I've been saying from the Rambam the last hour, for the Rambam, the main thing is what's going on in your thoughts and mind and feelings. You can express it in any language you want. Tefila b'chol loshen. You can in Birkas Hamazon, you can bench in any language you like. You can even say Kriya Shema in any language you like. The language is not important. It's true that we have established a Hebrew format for those people who can manage Hebrew. If you can't manage Hebrew, daven in English. So I remember so she was silent for a second. She said to me, "Are you sure? Are you sure that's true?" I said, "Well, all I can tell you is, I've been studying Talmud for 25, 30 years, and it's a very clearly described in the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch. Nobody disputes it. It's a fundamental principle of Tefillah, that Tefillah b'chol loshen, you can daven in any language you like. Only Birkas Kohanim has to be in Hebrew, but apart from that, everything else can be in any language you like." And at that moment, she got a bit angry. And she said, "Why did no one ever tell me this? How comes it? I've been going to Cheder, I've been going to Jewish schools and listening to rabbis talking my whole life. No one ever told me that I can pray in any language that I want." And she was furious. So I said, "Look, okay, now you found out. I agree that it's not correct that no one ever told you this. You should have been told this from the very beginning. But the Siddur is there. The Siddur, we'll come back to this, please God, next week a bit more in detail. Who wrote the Siddur and the function of the Siddur and why it's important and how to use it in the best way possible. Please God, stay tuned this time next week. Ellie, this time next week, please God, we will continue this series of Shiurim.
Yes, thank you very much, Rabbi Kimche. It was a wonderful share. We look forward to hear you again next week, as you say, the same time next week. I think we still have one sponsorship possibility for the 29th of July. These are sponsored. We're not charging anything for the shiurim. Anyone who's interested in sponsoring for an event, a yard site, or a happy event, please let me know by email or in any other way. Meanwhile, yes, thank you again for the sponsors today's show. We already mentioned them early on. It's a great pleasure to be able to give people a privilege actually to sponsor as well. It's something where they can really make their family history known as well. Thank you very much, Rabbi Kimche. It was wonderful. I'm going to unmute people just in case people have some complaints. Anyone wants to have a conversation?
Anyhow, very nice to see you all again, and look forward to.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
A great pleasure. Phil, nice to see you. Sylvia, nice to see you. Everybody else here, nice to see you all here. Shlomo Fox, nice to see you. All the Henry Israel and his wife, very nice to see you all.
Thank you very much.
And George, nice to see you as well. All the best.
Now, bye.